Well, working as an animator for so many years, I spent so much time indoors, and on a beautiful day like today, why not be out here? I'm talking to you today from beautiful Vermont in the peak of foliage season, and we're gonna spend this week talking about physics for animators. Not a lot of mathematics or complex calculations, but a little bit. And we're going to talk about nature, really, and physics, the laws of physics that describe patterns in nature that an animator wants to observe in order to make animation look a little more lifelike. The great Disney animator Frank Thomas talked about how an animator needs to come to the discipline with an understanding of how the grass and the trees and the sky and all that, quote, nonsense relates. And I think getting out of nature is critical. And if you look at those early Disney films, or any of them really, that observation of color and light and nature is really apparent. A colleague of mine and a fellow animation teacher once said that if an animation class doesn't start out with the bouncing ball exercise, find a different class. And I always adhere to that. Disney started out when he had a new animator with the bouncing ball exercise. In that exercise are all of the studies of the 12 principles and physics, and to master that exercise is critical to moving on to more complex motions and ideas in animation physics. One of the first principles of animation in Disney's 12 principles is the idea of exaggeration. Animation is sort of different from live action in that in animation we can exaggerate reality. We can exaggerate the laws of physics. We can exaggerate gravity and time. We can exaggerate the form. And that's one of the most exciting things about it. Too many student animators, and I think even some professionals, use animation to mimic what can be done with a live action camera. The opportunity of animation really allows us to explore the exaggeration of form and shape and time and physics in really exciting ways. Watching the leaves blow around reminds us that in nature very few things move in straight lines. And that's another principle of Disney's 12 principles, the idea of arcs. Things move in arcs. Very rarely, I've seen rain in Seattle that moves in a straight line, so I won't say never. But in nature, if you look at the leaves falling, or if you look at the way someone walks and their head bounces, they define a series of arcs. All the movement in nature generally defines arcs. And so when we look at movement, and particularly in the bouncing ball, we're going to be looking at the arc of movement. But we look at arcs in 3 dimensions. If I'm swinging a bat or moving something or waving a wand, it's defining an arc of some kind. So, second principle that we're going to talk about is arcs. One type of exaggeration in the 12 principles is called squash and stretch. I think it's very related to exaggeration, and it's interesting that it's a separate principle, but that's another topic. But Disney felt that to exaggerate the form, and in the bouncing ball we'll look at it in the way of sort of making the ball more elastic feeling. When something is traveling at a high velocity, Disney found that to exaggerate its form, to lengthen it, to stretch it, really enhanced the feeling of speed or velocity. And when something impacts or hits ground or is absorbing energy, to squash it gives it more of a feeling of absorbing that impact. Definitely related to physics, and we'll see this deeply and very clearly in the bouncing ball exercise. Another important principle in animation is timing, and we've looked at this a little bit. We have our frame rate. We have in film 24 frames per second, video 29.97 we've talked about, and we need to learn to fit our drawings within that paradigm of timing. And so we can make some simple calculations about time by multiplying frames per second by the number of seconds we want to make an animation move. We talked earlier about relation being important in animation, how one drawing relates to the next. And this gets to the next principle in animation, and that's called slow in and slow out. If we have an object and the drawings are spaced at an even clip, the movement is going to look very even. But if we want to create acceleration or deceleration, we use the same number of drawings but space them closer together or further together progressively. So if I have 24 drawings, 1,000, and I space them evenly, it's going to look very even. If we want it to speed up, we'll space the drawings closer together in the beginning and then further apart to achieve that sense of acceleration. And conversely, if we want an object to looks like it's coming to a rest, then we will progressively space the drawings closer and closer together. The next principle Disney talked, Another of Disney's 12 principles is straight ahead versus pose-to-pose animation. Pose-to-pose animation is the way it's done professionally, and that requires figuring out where one keyframe is, and then the next keyframe, and then filling in what are called in-betweens. So if you want to make 1 second of animation, you might make drawing number 1, and then drawing number 24, and then find drawing number 12, and then drawing number 6, and then drawing number 18, and so on. It's sort of antithetical to the way we think about kind of making a flip book maybe, where you'd make one drawing, you start with that drawing number 1, then make number 2, number 3, and number 4. The reason in the profession we use pose-to-pose is that we can control it better. We can control the timing, we can control where the object or the character starts and finishes the movement, and that's critical for planning. And when we look at computer animation, we're dealing with the same thing. So the terms in pose-to-pose animation that you'll hear are keyframes, tweens, in-betweening, and in straight ahead, very rarely used for professional animation, except when the animator wants to get some sort of fast action or be surprised by the outcome of the movement as well. One other principle is called overlapping action or follow-through. And if you think about a dog running and suddenly it sees a bone and it comes to a stop and maybe its ears flop forward a little bit, that's a good example of overlapping action. If you think about follow-through, this idea is where attached bodies to the main body continue to move beyond the main body. For example, if Superman is jumping on the ground and is wearing a cape, Superman might come to rest, but the cape might follow through a little bit after that. Think about hair or maybe the tail of the dog. If the dog comes to rest, the tail or the ears might flop forward, and that's used to make animation look a little more lifelike and believable. Some non-physics concepts of the 12 principles of animation are appeal, and Disney felt that drawings had to have appeal. Often we think of appeal as being something that's cute, like a bunny or something sweet, baby chick, but I think appeal has to do more with its relatability to an audience. I think a villain can have an appeal, and so appeal really gets down to how that character or that object affects an audience, and how the audience, I would say, projects their own feelings and emotions and maybe beliefs into that object. Disney also felt that solid drawing was one of the 12 principles, and by that he meant creating drawings that had dimensionality. And today I just take that to mean having a mastery of your tools. If you're a computer animator, pencil animator, puppet animator, just getting down with the tools and learning all you can about them and becoming as facile with them as possible in the creation of your work. Secondary action is another one of the principles that Disney talked about, and this is an action that isn't part of the main action, but that brings more life or believability or character to a character or an animation. For example, let's say someone in the script is thrown back or punched or falls or something, and as they get off they shake their head a little bit or maybe brush themselves off. So these are actions that sort of embellish the main action, called secondary actions. A couple other principles of animation are really useful, and one of them is very useful for illustration as well as animation, and that's called staging. Staging, basically, the simple rule is if the action reads well in silhouette, then it's probably a pretty good read to an audience. For example, if you pretend that I'm pulling a rabbit out of my hat, this is my hat and this is my rabbit's in there, and if I pull it out and say ta-da, and if I were to color this pose all in, basically you wouldn't read any action because the rabbit's here right in front of my face, the hat's here, and the silhouette would just obscure all of that. A better staging would be placing the magician like this, the hat maybe away from the body, a little bit of anticipation, which we'll talk about, and then reaching in, pulling out the rabbit, holding it here, holding the hat here, and then we have a very clear action that reads to an audience in silhouette and otherwise. So staging is a really important thing to consider when we're illustrating or making animations so that our actions read very well to an audience. You never want to hold a rabbit by its ears. Another important of Disney's 12 principles is anticipation. Anticipation allows the audience to take a moment to absorb what's about to happen. For example, we all know what this means. It means the character's about to run. And the beauty of that pose is that the audience then is set up for the action of running, and the animator doesn't actually have to draw running, can just draw some smoke or a little puff of something or some wisp lines in order to communicate the idea of running. But anticipation is helpful in many ways. Again, it telegraphs to the audience what's about to happen. So in the example of pulling a rabbit out of the hat, we had the hat and the rabbit's in here, and rather than grabbing it, there's a little anticipation. In physics, this works, say, in basketball, for example. You don't just jump to make a basket. Usually, you go down first and then up. And that is sort of a natural anticipation. So we look for, very often, in anticipation, a way to go the opposite direction. So back, then forward. If I'm going to throw a punch, we're not going to throw a punch, but if we're animating that, back, anticipation, then forward, rather than just kind of straight in to the action. So anticipation is a very useful tool for animators. Students are often surprised when they hear about what Pixar is looking for in character animators. Probably, arguably, one of the most successful computer animation companies in the world. And so you'd think they'd want people who are very proficient with computers, but actually for character animators, that's not the case. Can you guess what the 5 posted requirements are for Pixar? I'll tell you what they are. Number 1, storytelling ability. Think about that. Pixar is all about the story. Every color, every motion, every little blink of an eye needs to advance the story, and they do that very well. Number 2 is acting ability. Whether you're drawing a mouse or a monster, you as an animator need to be able to get inside that body and move it and feel it and emote it with a pencil, with a computer, and I think of a computer as just an expensive digital pencil. So storytelling ability, acting ability. The third one is traditional animation training, and that's what we're doing in this class. That's Disney's 12 principles. They even go far as to say, number 4, computer animation experience is helpful but not necessary. Why? They'll teach you their computers. Software changes every day, and Pixar has the ability to write code and software on a daily basis. So you're not going to learn their techniques. It's proprietary in any school anywhere. So if you have the storytelling, the acting, and the traditional animation experience, you can apply that to the computer. And then the last requirement that Pixar talks about for character animators is all-around art background, and that's drawing and music and dance and watercolor and sculpture and painting, all combined to create a more rounded artist. So next time you look at a very highly technical film by Pixar, remember what's underneath all of that polish. It's storytelling, it's acting, and it's traditional art making.